Welcome to this first series of podcasts. In this particular set, we're going to be looking at the foundations of corporate governance. So there are three key areas that we're going to cover. The first is thinking about what corporate governance actually means. The second is then thinking about the relationship between ethics and governance and what ethics is. And the third are some central theories about corporate governance. What are these ways or frameworks for thinking about corporate governance that can inform what we might want to do in actual practice? So, with no further ado, why don't we hop into this first element, which is actually defining what corporate governance is. Governance is one of those subjects that over the last 15-20 years, we've seen a huge increase in interest from the public. A lot of it had to do in the early days with some of the companies such as, for instance, HIH and WorldCom and Enron and their spectacular failures. But it's also touched many of the leading brands in the world, companies like Walt Disney with some CEO remuneration issues, James Hardie with some ethics and general directors' duties problems. And quite recently, we see problems about the culture and decision making in companies like Volkswagen. So governance and the way boards operate is obviously central to corporate life and our economic society in general. So this causes us to ask the question, what is corporate governance? And in fact, the term corporate governance is relatively new. It's only been around for 50 years at most. The first recorded use was in the 60s, and it was only really popularised in the last 30 years or so. Bob Tricker in particular had a lot to do with bringing the term corporate governance to the fore and thinking about boards. As a result, corporate governance can mean many different things to different people. One of the things I'd like us to think about is that corporate governance can mean a different level of analysis in terms of the subject matter. So sometimes corporate governance is referring to the system, so the national system of governance, so Australia's corporate governance system. And we talk a little bit about that in our sixth session together. Other times it's talking about the corporate governance of a company or how a board operates. So we're really focusing here on an organisation's corporate governance, so the governance of the organisation within the system. And finally, in terms of corporate governance, people will often be talking about an individual's responsibilities, like a director's duties. So we've got to be very careful when someone invokes this term corporate governance, what do they actually mean? I also should point out that to a lot of people, corporate governance is really about compliance. Now, that's not the take that we have in this particular subject and the way we deal with it. But just bear in mind that a lot of people will be hearing compliance when you say corporate governance, even though I personally don't think that's correct, and I think that there's a lot of definitions that suggest that isn't correct too. So because it's new, we do have lots of these definitions. I've pulled out a few here from the Securities Exchange, and Bob Tricker are these two. The key thing that we can see is that it's actually about a system or a framework, all aspects of direction and control or management. So it's how our companies, because it's corporate governance, how are companies directed and controlled. We get to see different emphases in the definition. It is about how the goals of that company are set, but it's also about the rights and responsibilities. And those rights and responsibilities often bring about risk to different parties and different definitions of performance. So it is dealing with all of these issues, how goals are set, how we manage risk, how we optimize performance, whatever performance is for your company. But it's also in finding the answers to those questions about the rights and responsibilities of our key stakeholders. That's where Cadbury's definition comes in, where he really starts talking about governance as this balance. So while, yes, we are often focused on the economic outcome, because that can be a primary purpose for a lot of corporations that we have, it is having that in balance with other rights and responsibilities. Those other rights and responsibilities include the economic social goals of the different stakeholders. A lot of governance is focused on efficiency, and that's why we do get this focus on economic wealth, okay, so shareholder value. But it also requires accountability. So who is going to be responsible for this separate legal entity? Now, I've just picked 3 classic definitions. There's a whole lot of others out there, but you'll start to see key themes in these definitions. It's about the direction and control. It's about how goals are set, how performance is optimized and managed, balancing the respective rights and responsibilities of our stakeholders. So that can get all a bit complicated. It gets particularly complicated when you start to say, okay, well, what's direction and what's management? And I think Bob Tricker's definition here is particularly useful. It's very simple, but I really like it, that management's about running the business. Governance is about making sure it's being run right. So because we have these different tensions in the system of governance, what we find is that there are different attributes that we can talk about. So governance involves tensions and trying to achieve certain outcomes. The outcomes that governance is really being focused on include, accountability, transparency, predictability, and participation. So let's have a bit more look at those. In terms of predictability, governance is trying to get a kind of repeatable outcome for the company, something that's not random, right? Because there are other people involved here and they want to be able to rely on the results. Clearly, transparency, often we're dealing with other people's money, and we'll come to agency theory, but it's and why that becomes so important. But it's just not money here. It's also their rights or their enjoyment. When we have particularly a corporation, they can affect a lot of lives. So there has to be some transparency, and along with that transparency, accountability. Who is actually responsible for the decision making? Who is going to get in trouble if the corporation makes the wrong decision? These are important things that we need to know if we're going to be able to have corporations operate in an acceptable way within society. And finally, do people have an appropriate level of participation in that decision making and in the way that they contribute to the decision making in the organisation? So that's just one way of thinking about what governance is aiming to do. A different way of thinking about governance is thinking through it as a series of balances. We have to balance the various stakeholder interests. Okay, yes, certainly shareholders have a particular focus, but these are often balanced with the views of employees, suppliers, and others, as we'll discuss during the course. It's also a balance in regulation, right? Too much, and that inhibits our economic wealth and even our social development if we regulate too much. But again, not enough regulation, and we get some bad outcomes. So we're really trying to get this tension and this balance in how we regulate governance. And by regulation, we mean not only external black letter law, but also the regulation that companies put on themselves, self-regulation, like industry codes and value statements. And it's also a balance between this conformance and performance, making sure that we do things the right way, that conform, but also that we achieve good outcomes. And sometimes these come into tension and need to be balanced. So, balancing the various stakeholders, balancing the regulatory environment to get to ensure that we can balance compliance and performance. So I hope that's given you just a brief introduction and an idea about what the subject matter is about. A lot of times we'll be talking about a paradox, and where often it's going to change the idea and what we need to do in corporate governance changes with the context we're in, and there can even be different views about what's right or what's wrong, because it is often about the balance that ensures the appropriate direction and control of the corporations in society.